Early 1945. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The Allied front is moving, but the war has entered a phase where movement alone no longer defines success. The maps show steady progress toward Germany, yet every arrow now carries consequences that extend beyond the battlefield. Speed is still possible. Freedom, however, has become complicated. Patton's Third Army continues to press forward with confidence shaped by earlier victories. Rapid exploitation has worked before. Gaps have collapsed. German units have withdrawn faster than expected. From the front, the logic appears simple. Fewer constraints mean faster results. Momentum, once unleashed, should not be interrupted. At headquarters, the same momentum looks different. Eisenhower does not doubt Patton's ability to advance. He weighs what full operational freedom would require from the system supporting it. Fuel priorities would shift. Adjacent armies would have to adjust. Political balance inside the coalition would be tested. Speed, if left unbounded, would no longer belong to one army alone. Its effects would spread. This is not a dispute over competence. It is a choice about responsibility. Eisenhower understands that granting freedom is not neutral. Every constraint removed in one place appears elsewhere as risk. There is no formal request, no dramatic exchange. The pressure builds through results themselves. Patton's momentum asks a question the system must answer. How much freedom can be allowed when the war's outcome is no longer in doubt, but its consequences still are? Eisenhower's answer begins to form, not as denial, but as design. By the beginning of 1945, the Western Allied campaign had reached a point where success imposed its own constraints. The rapid advances following the Normandy breakout had transformed the operational landscape. German forces had been driven from France and much of Belgium. The front now pressed against Germany's western defenses, and the final phase of the war in Europe was coming into view. Yet the conditions that enabled speed in the summer of 1944 no longer existed. Eisenhower's broad front strategy was shaped by coalition reality. British, American, and French armies advanced under a single command structure, but with different political expectations and logistical capacities. Maintaining balance among them was not optional. It was the foundation of Allied unity. Any concentration of freedom or resources in one sector inevitably created pressure elsewhere. By late 1944, that pressure had become more visible and more dangerous. Patton's Third Army had earned its reputation during the pursuit across France. Its rapid exploitation of German collapse demonstrated how momentum could substitute for mass. Patton's approach relied on initiative, speed, and the willingness to act before the enemy recovered. In that environment, freedom of action produced results that planning alone could not. Eisenhower benefited directly from those results, and he recognized their value. The Ardennes counteroffensive altered the calculus. Although the German attack ultimately failed, it exposed vulnerabilities created by assumption and overextension. Allied confidence had outpaced coordination. The lesson was not that speed was wrong, but that speed without alignment carried risk. Eisenhower absorbed this lesson at the theater level, where failure would not be isolated to a single army. Logistics reinforced the need for restraint. Fuel shortages were chronic. Rail networks lagged behind the front. Winter weather disrupted supply and air support. Every major movement required prioritization, and prioritization carried political meaning. Granting one army greater freedom meant reallocating scarce resources, often at the expense of others. Eisenhower could not allow momentum alone to dictate those decisions. political considerations grew heavier as Allied forces approached Germany. The war was no longer solely about liberation. Occupation, governance, and post-war influence were already being negotiated. How territory was entered mattered. Which army arrived first mattered. Uncoordinated speed risked undermining agreed frameworks before they were fully implemented. Patton's desire for greater freedom emerged naturally from this context. From the front, constraints appeared artificial. Enemy resistance seemed uneven. Opportunities appeared fleeting. Every delay felt like a gift to the German command. Patton's logic was consistent with his experience. Act decisively, and problems resolve themselves. Eisenhower's perspective was shaped by responsibility rather than opportunity. He had to ensure that success in one sector did not destabilize the entire front. Freedom granted too broadly could not be easily reclaimed. Once momentum shifted political expectations, reversing it would be costly. German leadership observed these tensions carefully. As Allied advances slowed and synchronized, German defensive planning shifted toward delay and preservation. When Allied freedom appeared unconstrained, opportunities for exploitation increased. Eisenhower's task was to deny the enemy that leverage by regulating Allied action before imbalance appeared. This context explains why full freedom became an issue without ever being formally requested. It was implied by success itself. Patton's momentum demonstrated what could be achieved with latitude. Eisenhower had to decide how much of that latitude the system could sustain. The answer would not come as a rejection of initiative, but as a recalibration of authority. The war had entered a phase where freedom had to be weighed against responsibility, and where the cost of excess autonomy could no longer be absorbed quietly. From this background, Eisenhower's choice began to take shape. From Patton's perspective, freedom was inseparable from effectiveness. His experience told him that initiative lost was rarely regained. German forces, when given time, reorganized quickly. Commanders who waited for perfect alignment surrendered advantage to an enemy skilled at delay. To Patton, operational freedom meant the ability to act on judgment formed at the front, where conditions were observed directly rather than inferred from reports. Eisenhower viewed freedom through a different lens. As Supreme Allied Commander, he was not deciding how far one army could advance, but how much risk the coalition could absorb. Freedom at one point on the front translated into exposure elsewhere. A rapid advance altered supply priorities, shifted air support, and forced neighboring armies to adjust. Eisenhower understood that autonomy, once granted, could not be contained within a single headquarters. Subordinate commanders felt this tension daily. Corps and division staffs prepared plans that assumed initiative, yet waited for approval shaped by wider considerations. Freedom existed, but it was conditional. Commanders learned to frame proposals not only in terms of opportunity, but in terms of sustainability and coordination. Initiative became something to justify, not simply to exercise. Allied political leaders interpreted freedom as intent. When one army appeared to move faster or farther than others, questions arose about balance and influence. British leaders watched carefully for signs that American momentum might redefine coalition priorities. French authorities were sensitive to how liberation and occupation unfolded on their territory. Eisenhower absorbed these concerns as part of his command burden, long before they surfaced publicly. The human dimension reinforced Eisenhower's caution. Soldiers advancing rapidly encountered civilian populations transitioning from occupation to Allied control. Discipline, conduct, and symbolism mattered. Incidents created under conditions of rapid movement carried political weight disproportionate to their scale. Eisenhower recognized that freedom without restraint increased the chance of such moments. German command evaluated Allied behavior opportunistically. When Allied advances appeared unconstrained, German planners looked for openings, gaps between armies, stretched supply lines, or opportunities for propaganda. When Allied freedom narrowed into coordination, German options shrank. The enemy's ability to exploit Allied initiative depended on how predictable that initiative became. Each perspective reflected rational priorities shaped by responsibility. Patton saw freedom as the engine of victory. Eisenhower saw it as a variable to be managed. Subordinates navigated between ambition and approval. Politicians watched for imbalance. German command searched for leverage. What united these views was recognition that freedom was no longer neutral. It carried consequences beyond intent. The closer Allied forces moved toward Germany, the more autonomy risked reshaping outcomes the coalition had not chosen deliberately. By early 1945, the meaning of freedom had changed. It was no longer a simple operational preference. It was a strategic question, one that demanded a decision not about speed, but about control. The moment when Eisenhower's choice became unavoidable did not arrive as a single decision point. It emerged as the cumulative effect of momentum pressing against limits that could no longer be stretched. By early 1945, the Allied advance had entered a stage where success itself demanded regulation. Eisenhower recognized that granting full operational freedom was no longer a theoretical question. It was being asked implicitly by results. Patton's advances demonstrated what latitude could achieve. They also revealed how quickly autonomy translated into system-wide consequences. Fuel priorities shifted. Air support had to be reassigned. Adjacent armies were forced to adapt to movements they had not initiated. Each adjustment increased political and logistical exposure. The choice Eisenhower faced was not between freedom and control in absolute terms. It was between allowing freedom to define the campaign's shape by default, or imposing structure that would preserve balance. The Ardennes experience weighed heavily. Surprise had shown how quickly assumptions could be exploited when coordination lagged behind momentum. Eisenhower could not risk repeating that pattern at a moment when the war's outcome and its aftermath were being decided simultaneously. His response took form through procedure. Approval chains tightened. Boundaries between operational zones were clarified. Resource allocation became more deliberate and less responsive to momentum alone. Freedom was not withdrawn, but it was conditioned. Movement would continue, but within parameters designed to ensure that success could be sustained and absorbed. For Patton, the change was evident in how proposals were handled. Plans that once moved forward on the strength of opportunity now required demonstration of compatibility with broader objectives. The tempo of advance adjusted accordingly. Patton retained initiative, but it operated within a narrower corridor. The system no longer allowed speed to substitute for coordination. This shift marked the turning point. Once Eisenhower concluded that full freedom could not be managed without cost to coalition stability, there was no practical path back to earlier latitude. The decision was not announced. It did not require confrontation. It was embedded into the machinery of command. German leadership observed the altered rhythm. Allied pressure remained constant, but its character changed. Advances were integrated, supported, and predictable. Opportunities to exploit Allied overextension diminished as coordination became visible. German planning increasingly emphasized delay rather than disruption. At the coalition level, Eisenhower's choice reassured partners. British and French commanders saw confirmation that operational success would not override political balance. Authority remained centralized. The campaign's direction reflected collective control rather than individual momentum. The turning point, therefore, was Eisenhower's decision to prioritize system integrity over maximal autonomy. He chose to regulate freedom rather than unleash it. That choice did not slow the war's conclusion. It shaped how that conclusion would be reached. From this point forward, Patton's operations continued, but they did so under conditions defined by Eisenhower's calculation. Freedom remained a tool, not a principle. Momentum survived, but it no longer dictated outcomes on its own. Once this recalibration took hold, the campaign moved toward its final phase under a new equilibrium, one where control and initiative coexisted, but freedom no longer stood apart from responsibility. The consequences of Eisenhower's choice unfolded gradually, but they reshaped how the final months of the campaign were conducted. Full operational freedom did not disappear, yet it no longer operated unchecked. Initiative was preserved, but its expression was bounded by visibility and coordination. For Patton and the Third Army, this meant operating within a more explicit framework. Advances continued, but they were increasingly synchronized with neighboring formations and resource plans. The tempo remained aggressive, yet less elastic. Success no longer translated into immediate expansion of authority. Instead, it reinforced the requirement to demonstrate alignment with the broader theater design. Eisenhower absorbed the political weight that this regulation was designed to prevent. Allied leaders directed concerns toward chef rather than toward individual commanders. By centralizing responsibility, Eisenhower shielded field commanders from diplomatic friction while ensuring that no single army appeared to be shaping outcomes independently. This choice preserved Patton's effectiveness while reducing the political exposure that came with his momentum. At the coalition level, cohesion strengthened. British and French leadership saw that American operational dominance would not override agreed structures. Resource allocation appeared balanced. Advances unfolded in ways that supported shared narratives of liberation and control. This perception mattered as discussions about occupation zones and post-war authority intensified. Logistically, the system stabilized. Fuel distribution became more predictable. Supply lines aligned more closely with planned movements, rather than reactive exploitation. While opportunities were sometimes delayed, fewer operations risked stalling due to overextension. Reliability replaced improvisation as the dominant rhythm. German command felt the impact indirectly. Allied advances remained relentless, but the opportunities created by imbalance diminished. The enemy faced pressure that was sustained rather than episodic. Attempts to exploit Allied overreach yielded fewer results as coordination tightened across the front. The strategic effect was endurance. The campaign's momentum became harder to disrupt because it no longer depended on exceptional freedom in isolated sectors. Progress continued under conditions that the coalition could sustain politically and logistically. Eisenhower's choice reduced volatility at the cost of some flexibility. What Eisenhower ultimately accepted was responsibility rather than control. He chose to manage freedom rather than grant it fully. In doing so, he ensured that momentum served the alliance rather than challenged it. By the time Allied forces approached the final crossings into Germany, the consequences of this choice were clear. The advance moved forward not as a series of independent thrusts, but as a coordinated pressure that the system could carry to conclusion. This episode endures because it reveals a limit that only appears near victory. Operational freedom, so effective in moments of collapse and pursuit, becomes harder to sustain as success accumulates responsibility. The closer the war came to its conclusion, the less freedom could be allowed to operate without consequence. Patton's desire for latitude was consistent with his role and his experience. Speed had delivered results when hesitation would have prolonged the fight. In that sense, freedom was not recklessness. It was an extension of proven method. What changed was not the value of that method, but the environment in which it was applied. Eisenhower's choice reflected a different obligation. As Supreme Allied Commander, he was responsible not only for defeating Germany, but for how that defeat occurred. Coalition unity, political legitimacy, and post-war authority depended on control as much as momentum. Granting full freedom to any single commander would have transferred risk that could not be contained at the battlefield level. Historically, this moment illustrates why coalition command rewards restraint. Initiative remains essential, but it must be shaped by systems capable of absorbing its effects. Eisenhower did not suppress aggression. He designed a framework in which aggression could succeed without undermining the alliance that sustained it. The war in Western Europe ended not because freedom was maximized, but because it was managed. Patton's momentum continued to matter, but it no longer defined outcomes alone. Eisenhower's leadership lay in recognizing when autonomy had reached its limit and acting before its cost became irreversible. In choosing structure over full freedom, Eisenhower ensured that victory arrived intact. The decision preserved momentum, protected unity, and carried the alliance through the war's final phase without allowing success itself to become a liability. That balance, between freedom and responsibility, remains one of the quiet foundations of Allied victory.